Thank you very much. My book was published only 5 days ago, and since then I've done some taping sessions with some of the nationally syndicated radio shows. But this is the first live event for Johnny Appleseed, and of course it couldn't happen in a more appropriate place. And not only because we are in the newly renovated Johnny Appleseed Educational Center and Museum. Joe Biesecker was one of the first people I contacted after Simon & Schuster agreed to publish the book, but before I had really written a word of it. And Joe's been a terrific help from day one. One of the Johnny Appleseed Society trustees, Arthur Humphrey, Arthur's sitting right over here in the end of this row, if you don't know who he is, has done wonderful research into the roots of John Chapman's Introduction to Emanuel Swedenborg and the Church of the New Jerusalem. And Arthur also gave freely of his time and knowledge once I was able to latch onto him. And I say latch, although Arthur might be more inclined to think of a blood-sucking parasite, but still he was very generous with his time and his knowledge. And while I'm digressing at the beginning, I should also add that one of the problems I faced in this book from the beginning was when to refer to its title character as John Chapman and when to refer to him as Johnny Appleseed. In general, Chapman refers to the historical figure, while Appleseed to the myth that he became. But the two are so intertwined that the distinction gets misty and sometimes a little worse than misty, I'm afraid. But that's generally what I'm trying to hold to here in these comments. Back to where we are where we are, Urbana the city and Urbana the university. Both are, as all of you know here actually, are bursting with Chapman-Appleseed connections. Urbana was where Chapman met with attorney John James to discuss possible legal proceedings concerning one of his orchards. One of those very rare moments when the historical figure steps out from behind the curtain and lets us have a good look at him. For the record, Chapman paced the room while he talked and chewed on nuts. John James, for his part, donated the land, as you all know, in which this college rose in 1850 as the only Swedenborg-affiliated college west of the Alleghenies, the fulfillment of a dream long held by John Chapman. The first president of the college, botanist Milo Williams, was well acquainted with Chapman, shared many common interests with him, and reportedly committed to paper what almost certainly would have been the most lengthy and illuminating portrait of Chapman by any of his contemporaries, but that manuscript, alas, has gone missing. So many things have gone missing in this, there's so many tempting little moments that you just can't quite find the document. And maybe you all have the documents in your home drawers, and if so, let me know. The Johnny Appleseed complex, where we are meeting today, is located in the combined Bailey and Barclay halls, named for Francis Bailey, the Philadelphia printer generally considered to be the father of the new church in America, and for Bailey's ward, Hester Barclay, sister-in-law to John Young, who, as Arthur has shown very convincingly, almost certainly gave Johnny Appleseed his first taste of Swedenborg. The place crawls with connections, direct and indirect. For me, at least, perhaps the most rewarding of them all is the fact that this museum happens to be the repository of the papers of Florence Murdoch, the longtime secretary of the New Church Library in Cincinnati, because it was in those papers that I was able to trace the history of how Johnny Appleseed happened to make his film debut. The story begins with a December 1944 letter to Murdoch from a librarian of the Indiana Historical Society. The librarian wanted to let Murdoch know that two studios, MGM and Disney, have been asking around about Johnny Appleseed. Of the two, the librarian clearly preferred Disney take on the job, but she wasn't 100% certain. I only trust, she wrote, that they did not do something peculiar and horrible. Movies so often do. 3.5 years later, with the MGM movie scrapped and Disney's animated version of Johnny's life headed to theaters nationwide, Murdoch was convinced that something peculiar and horrible was exactly what the Walt Disney Studio had done. And on May 26, 1948, the day before the cartoon classic Melody Time was released, Murdoch wrote Walt Disney to correct the error of his ways. Her letter begins on a high note, with Murdoch praising the studio for celebrating Johnny's Blessings 3, Love and Faith in an Apple Tree. But then the tone grows more heated. Publicity for the movie had showed Johnny goaded on to greatness by a sourpuss apparition in a coonskin cap, Johnny's guardian angel. And for Murdoch, that was playing way too fast and loose with the spirit world that was central to Swedenborg's vision. Quote, "The advertisements we have seen indicate that the subject is treated in a relatively conservative manner, except for that extraordinarily grotesque figure of a guardian angel. We are curious to know by what process of reasoning your studio arrived at this strange conception." What to do? Well, Murdoch had several suggestions. Is it too, and keep in mind this is one day before the movie is to be released. Is it too late, she asked, to make a change there, perhaps substituting the figure of a child? If a traditional angel would seem out of place, she asked Disney. Or if that is impossible, could not the name be changed from guardian angel to perhaps spirit of the frontier? Excuse me a second. Let me digress here once again. Did anybody here ever meet Florence Murdoch? In the course of doing this, I've gotten this vision of her as one of these stalwart DAR types, you know, sort of barreling forward about this high, very buxom. And DAR women always wore completely blue dresses in my day, but they had a little ornateness at the top. But anyway, she sort of stuck in my mind that way. In any event, Disney never replied, and the last-second corrections Murdoch requested never were made. And that's probably just as well, because without his guardian angel, Disney's Johnny Appleseed never would have gathered the gumption to leave his non-existent farm near Pittsburgh, much less cross the Ohio River into the wilderness of the Northwest Territory. In Disney's The Old Settler, Johnny Appleseed and Johnny's Angel, poor Johnny is, quote, such a sawed-off scrawny fella, despite being, by all accounts, exactly the average height of his time, 5 foot 9 inches, and weren't no pioneer and he knowed it, notwithstanding the fact that he had walked across the mountains of Pennsylvania, survived brutal winters in a hostile environment, and, quote, ain't got the muscle or the breadth of chest, ludicrous on the face of it, to join the pioneer parade heading west. Worse, there's not even a hint of the intellectual depth and intensity that John Chapman would have needed to wrestle his way into Swedenborg's truths, as he obviously did. But that's Hollywood. And my 5-year-old grandson adored the cartoon, as 5-year-olds have been doing now for 6 decades, more than 6 decades. And what's more, if the Disney studio took the Appleseed myth and pushed it over the top, the storyline was already headed that way, and studio executives were more than prepared to defend their work. In a lengthy response to Florence Murdoch, dated June 23, 1948, and on the wall behind me, and this is one of the wonderful treasures of this museum, Hal Edelquist, who was manager of Disney's story department, explained how the animated film, and particularly Johnny's guardian angel, came to be. Johnny, Edelquist wrote, was a simple and unassuming man. He believed his mission of planting trees in the wilderness to be divinely inspired, and firmly believed in the direct physical manifestation of heavenly beings upon the earth. And thus it would seem to follow, Edelquist wrote, that Johnny's divine interpretation might well take the form of a frontier angel. But Edelquist didn't stop there. We believe, he concluded, that our interpretation of the Johnny Appleseed story, though presented with a certain whimsical humor, is the nearest approach to a sermon on the subject of brotherly love and unselfishness ever attempted in our medium of entertainment. I can't disagree with that. The cartoon short is exactly what Edelquist described, a sweet sermon on brotherly love. But as happens with a lot of sermons, the man on whom it is built disappears completely almost in the truths being manifested. And that's really where this book began, because it's where I began. I was one of those 5-year-olds who first learned about Johnny Appleseed from the Walt Disney cartoon treatment. And this is the Johnny Appleseed I still knew back in 1989, long after I was 5 years old, when a friend first suggested I take on this project. As the nearly 24 years between now and then might suggest, I didn't exactly jump at the idea. Other work had priority, and why take on a biography of such a known quantity? But I did nibble at the prospect off and on, and as I did, the story just got richer and richer until, I guess, I almost felt compelled to jump into it.